E ok? Și ciocanul care a înlocuit bormașina. Ok, ne descurcăm. Mulțumim mult. Chiar aș vrea să închidem ușile. Cu riscul de a lăsa colegi pe afară. As we said, the whole event today will be in English without interpretation, just to speed things up. And we have, I hope, a very interesting program. We actually have two highlights today. One is the International Day of the Croissant, as I know, and I have you had enough of them at the entrance. And the second is, of course, the annual report of EFOR. As always, we try to highlight at the beginning of the year what is important, what is crucially important from the last month in political and economic developments in Romania, and look forward. And my God, we have a lot to report this year. There are political developments which are very concerning, not just in Romania, but in the region and in the Western world. There's polarization, there's this wave of sovereignism, which is increasing, and we see the result in elections. We have polarization of the electorates. And the result of this is that we have a shrinking space for the civil society all across our region, including the EU member states. And when I'm saying civil society, this also includes mass media. And this is very important in a democracy because, as you know, and if you noticed in Romania, the major news, journalism investigations appeared were the result of the work of these cooperatives of journalists, which work mostly online and at the margins, while the mainstream media, they don't produce much, I have to say, in terms of real investigative content. So media is becoming more like us, like NGOs, and the space is shrinking for them as well. In Romania, this is compounded, all these, general regional trends are compounded by a deterioration in the quality of governance, which is visible, and even the deterioration in the human quality of the leaders, which is also visible, and I don't have to enter into details here, but it's pretty obvious. There's these strategies that we've seen last year to put some distance between politics and the electorate, which backfired spectacularly in the November elections. And now we wonder, we bought some time until May when we repeat the elections, and the question is, to what extent, we will not see a repetition on an even higher scale of the backlash against the political class that we saw in November. It's not just us. There are elections in Germany, as you know, in February, very, very important for Europe. There are elections, of course, in Romania, as you know, in the first part of May. In Poland, presidential elections, simultaneous with our second round. So when we have the second round in May, they will have the first round for the presidential elections. And there's also, the stakes are very high. Then we have the Republic of Moldova, where I would say the stakes are even higher, the parliamentary elections, summer or probably September. Then we have Czech Republic by October. At some point by October, again, it could be a very nasty reversal of politics. So the trend is general, and the question is, what do we do? What do we do in such a situation? So we have the report. We have a special guest today, Peter Pomerantsev, who's actually one of the best researchers in propaganda, and he knows the region here. We invited him to speak, on topics which are addressed in his books. One such topic would be a fascinating one. To what extent freedom of speech is still compatible with the liberal values of democracy as we know them? Because historically, liberal democracy and freedom of speech went hand in hand. It was abolition of censorship and the expansion of freedom of speech. While now we see a totally different situation. at least we see a dilemma. Freedom of speech for everyone led to a radicalization of discourse, to unacceptable things a few years ago which are now okay to be said in public. And how can we conceive a new kind of democracy where freedom of speech works against the liberal values of democracy? And the second, and this was explored in his book, This Is Not Propaganda, and in his latest book, which is on sale today as well, the question is, can we turn the table on the black propaganda of Kremlin, for example, in our region? Because obviously we cannot fight their lies and manipulations with truth. We tried and it doesn't work. I mean, fact-checking, if you put it, the truth near in a column near the propaganda items, it doesn't work. You don't convince people. Can we be more aggressive? Can we engage in our own, liberal democratic discourse, but in a much more bold manner in order to fight back? And this is something very topical. We are struggling with these questions today. And I'm finishing here. I will give the floor to Peter, but not before letting you know that you have on your seats 2 QR codes on the leaflets. One leads to the report that we discussed today, the other one to our website, where we kindly solicit your contribution, so it's a donation page. And this will go mostly to Vote Correct, which is an initiative of EFOR to monitor the elections in May. We don't have project support for that yet, so we rely on donations. And the second part of the donation will be for Ukraine, which we have been doing for 3 years. Also, ship over aid in Ukraine and do some support for the Ukrainian refugees who are present here. And at the end, when we finish around 12:30, you are invited actually to buy books if you want to have them signed. So there's a book over there. The printing house is here, Cartier from Chisinau, a very good printing house. You can buy the book, and then Peter will sign the copies that you buy. And I think I didn't forget anything, right, Otilia? Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Soren, thank you so much. If I speak too fast, just wave to me to slow down, like a traffic policeman, just flag me down. So I got in very late last night from Chisinau, so sorry if I need a lot of coffee. So I'm going to talk a little bit about myself, so that you get to know me. But luckily in my books, I talk about myself quite a lot, so it's also a way to talk more about the second and third book, and maybe the first one we'll get back to. But just so you understand about me, I work in the US at Johns Hopkins University in Washington, which I'm about to go back to on Saturday, a city that is hit by a whirlwind when I return to it. But I'm English, but I was actually born in Kiev, in Ukraine. My parents are Ukrainian Jews. And the reason I tell you about this was because really everything I do now is in a dialogue with everything they did. So my parents, probably like many of you here of a certain generation, were very opposed to the communist regime. They would listen to Radio Free Europe on radios secretly at night, trying to break through Soviet censorship. My father was a poet. He wrote this very sort of anti-communist poetry, which was all about self-expression, about feelings, about modernism, all about breaking free of the sort of the Soviet social realism, so freedom as an artistic form. But he was a political dissident, and in my second book, This Is Not Propaganda, I start off about talking his arrest by the KGB in 1978 for, giving out copies of Solzhenitsyn and Nabokov and Sinyavsky to his friends. And I know things were even harder here, but he was sort of charged with distributing illegal literature, which got you, I think, around 9 years in those days. So again, I think this is all very familiar to most people here. And I tell their story in the book, and you'll have to read the book to find out what happened to them. But the reason I tell their story is not because I'm writing a family memoir, but because through them, I'm telling the principles of how we always thought about what Soren was just talking about. What is the relationship between information and democracy and dictatorship? And in the story of my parents, you really have, a metonymy, I guess, of the 20th century struggle for a democratic public sphere, for a democratic information space. First of all, the battle against censorship, the attempt to get more media in a closed society. The assumption that pluralism is good for democracy. Yeah? The more media that we will have, the better our democracy will be. Dictators want to have one newspaper, democracies have many, and it's messy, and there's lies, and not all of it has to be pure, but because there's many, you have this marketplace of ideas, this idea that the best information will somehow rise to the top. And underlining all this, maybe the most important thing that we don't always think about, which is reflected in my father's poetry, just this idea of self-expression and freedom and breaking through of constraints as always being a positive, as always being related to democracy. And of course, well, last but not least, maybe the most obvious one, the idea that information traveling across borders between America and the Soviet Union was good for democracy. Yeah. But today, in the environment that I work in, we've sort of found that all these principles have been turned, if not upside down, or suddenly under question. Yeah? Everything that my parents struggled for, were arrested for, suffered for, now doesn't seem as easy as it was to capture in a set of principles. So what do I mean? In This Is Not Propaganda, in my second book, I sort of travel the world. And the first thing that I notice as I go to Latin America, Southeast Asia, the US, Europe, and I talk to propagandists, and I talk to people like my parents today, dissidents across the world, fighting for rights, is that so much has been turned upside down. So let's start with freedom of speech. Across the world, you see regimes not just using censorship, some still use censorship, of course, to suppress people's rights, but instead, they will attack them with huge amounts of online trolls, mobs, vast armies of bots. I tell the story of Maria Ressa in the Philippines in my book, before she became a Nobel Prize winner, an award-winning journalist, who came under attack from this huge online campaign discrediting her, smearing her, saying she was a CIA spy, saying all sorts of things which destroyed her reputation, the reputation of her newspaper. And after a while, it wasn't clear straight away, after a while she realized this wasn't organic, this was a government coordinated campaign against her. But when she would talk about it, the government's propagandists would say, but hey, this is freedom of speech. Why shouldn't we have freedom of speech too? Yeah? There's nothing in freedom of speech in the UN Declaration on freedom of speech, or in the EU one, which says anything about truth or lies or disinformation. Yeah? It's just the ability to impart content and receive content. But the technology has changed so much that you can now flood the environment with so much confusion, viciousness, doubt, that the truth is drowned out and people's rights are drowned out. But when they try to struggle against it, when they say take down these things, do something about it, the answer is, well, that's censorship. You guys are against censorship. I thought we were freedom fighters. So freedom of speech has been turned on its head. And associated with that is this, well, it turned out to be a kind of mystical idea about the marketplace of ideas. Yeah? This idea that actually we're rational human beings and we will choose the most accurate information. If there's lots of it, people are sensible and rational and they'll choose the most high quality information, which is the belief underlying the amount of thinking that we did around this cliche that we live in a marketplace of ideas. But even the idea of pluralism, yeah? The idea that the more media you have is better for democracy has been undermined. I mean, I live in the US, it's most striking there. We've seen pluralism tip into polarization so vicious, echo chambers so deep, divides of unreality so high, that the idea of a public sphere, of a democratic public sphere where different parties' interests disagree, debate, come to consensus, seems completely impossible. And of course, and you're going to have to tell me more about this here, but the idea that information traveling across borders would bring more peace and more global understanding and greater harmony has been severely questioned by the ease with which you can now conduct subversive operations across borders. So all these principles have been undermined. The marketplace of ideas, the idea that freedom of speech always favors democratic activists, pluralism as an automatic helper of debate, and cross-border media. These great principles that my parents fought for are now co-opted by anti-democratic forces. But I think also underneath that, the idea of a free personality that my father would write about in his poetry of the 70s, even that, I think, is very, very questioned now. I mean, in a sense, every one of us can express all they like on social media. Every one of us can be a great modernist poet exposing their soul on social media. Everyone can scream about their feelings, but the more you talk about yourself on social media, the more data you are giving governments or companies to understand your psychology, understand your habits, understand your desires, which allows them to manipulate you in ways much more sophisticated and much more precise than in the Soviet Union. So the more you express yourself, the more you push out your ego or your id, whatever you want, actually, the less freedom you're going to have. So even that has been undermined, you know, this great 20th century free jazz of the soul, which autocrats were so scared of, has been turned upside down. My favorite part of my second book is actually telling the story of how my father's poetry transformed over the decades, how he moved away from a desire to express the self as the decades went on, because it had become cheapened. It wasn't actually revolutionary anymore. But anyway, I mean, the book is actually about the competition between propaganda and poetry with some stuff about, you know, theory of the public sphere. So what do we do about it? Because, you know, this is now no longer just a question for people in the Philippines or in Russia or in Latin America. You know, these are questions which are striking right into the heart of the European Union. And here, obviously, Chisinau, and America, where I go back to on Saturday, which has become, in many ways, the cauldron of all these controversies. So I'm just going to touch on maybe some of the key things that we can start doing to think through these issues set, and then we can continue the conversation, because it's so, I mean, it's a common one. I don't have all the solutions. Let's start with freedom of speech and regulation. Because when we're talking about freedom of speech, we're talking about laws and norms. One instinct has been, as freedom of speech has become abused by authoritarian forces, one instinct has been to try to regulate content. Yeah? To say, that's a lie, that's disinformation, take it down. Now, there are moments when maybe that's necessary, when a piece of content endangers national security or public health. But most of the time, when we're talking about political speech, trying to take down content is actually against all the norms of freedom of speech. It's also a complete misunderstanding of the online space. The idea that you could go content by content and take it down online is kind of absurd. You know, there's a lot of stuff that my in-laws, and I won't say which ones, put online, which is deeply wrong. You know, I have various relatives, both in Russia and America, and my God, I disagree with all of them. But so what? I'm going to call Facebook and say, well, Uncle Vanya has put up some total bullshit, take it down. This is not old media. This is not newspapers where you can go and say, please correct this mistake. This is people talking in a square. We're applying the vision of the 20th century to the 21st. What matters online is, of course, not pieces of content, but the systems that amplify, that push them, that target them. Yeah? It's not the content that needs to be regulated. There's nothing new about content. Content is exactly the same as it was in the 20th century. If it was illegal in the 20th century, it's illegal now. Child pornography, attacks on elections in many countries, they're illegal. You don't have to do anything new. What is new is the algorithms. What is new is the computer systems that make a choice. I'm going to take what Uncle Vanya said and make it number one and push it to 100 million, and that's a choice made by a company. Or said, well, Uncle Vanya said something that can be down here, who cares? Yeah? It's the architecture, the targeting, the amplification, that's what needs to be regulated. And here I think, in order to do that, we can actually take back freedom of speech. Because there is a huge lie being said by the authoritarians who engineer online mobs and trolls to go after people, by regimes in Russia and China who control the internet systems, or by the owners of vast social media companies today, whether TikTok or X or others. They all say they're for freedom of speech. They're not. Freedom of speech is not just the ability to impart information. Yeah? It's also the right to receive it. That's in the UN Declaration of Human Rights. It's both to impart and receive information. And we currently have no idea why TikTok is supporting one campaign and not another, why X is pushing one story and not another, why Facebook is taking down this and not that, and so on and so forth. So we can reclaim freedom of speech and say, radical transparency. We need to understand everything that you're doing. Every choice you make should be accountable to us. And then we can start having a dialogue. Then we can see what you're up to. And then we start to regulate around that. If you are making political choices, then we have to start thinking about you as a publisher. And then, yes, you are responsible for what's on your platform. But until we have that transparency, we're actually living in the dark. We have more information than ever before, yeah? But less understanding of the environment and how it's created. I think we can pursue that by going back to the essence of freedom of speech. We don't need new principles. We can reclaim the democratic language for this. And companies that don't follow that, then yes, they can't be on our market. If you are not giving us freedom of understanding how you operate, no, you can't work here. Because that's an attack on our freedom of speech. Yeah, you're overriding our rights. And that would then become the difference between an authoritarian social media and a democratic one. In a democracy, we would have that transparency. It would be a digital republic where we have ways of controlling and holding the forces that control our information environment to account, while that will never happen in China or Russia. Yeah? Xi Jinping and Putin will never open up their internet. They don't want their populations to understand how they're manipulating. They don't want their populations to understand when is it a real person or when is it a troll farm talking. That then becomes the difference between the two, and never really leaving the principles of freedom of speech. But there's only so much regulation can do. It would be kind of weird and scary and not very democratic if we could regulate our way out of something to do with political speech. That's not how democracies act. So the second thing I think we need to think about is the design of our public space. Yeah? Think about it like a city. Yeah? Think about the internet as a city. Think about the digital public space as a city. This is not my metaphor. It's a guy called Eli Pariser who I've interviewed. Basically, at the moment, the internet city looks a bit like a dystopia. Who's seen Blade Runner? No, a couple of you have seen Blade Runner. You basically have a couple of very scary private companies owning the city. Facebook, God knows what TikTok is, X, who are there to exploit you commercially. Fair enough, that's fine. We're allowed in a city to have malls and shops. That's fine. They can exist. And then you kind of have, at the moment in our internet city, you kind of have the really scary, illegal back streets, you know? The dark net full of drug selling and child prostitution and all the horror of our underworld. And you don't have anything else. Like, in a real city, you would have parks and libraries and town halls and places where you meet that don't try to take your money. They're designed as public spaces. And we need the same thing for the internet. There can be a Facebook where essentially they use you as a product, but then there should be somewhere else which is designed to have political debates, somewhere else which is designed for education. But just as with the city, somebody has to invest in that. Yeah? We invest in public spaces. We need to invest in public online spaces, which are designed in different ways, which are not designed to make us addicted, to hate, to fight, which are designed in a different way. And we can talk about the various experiments that are happening around that, amazing innovations in Taiwan, in America, everywhere. There's loads of great ideas and pilots about how to create a social media that's better for political debate. The problem is there's no one to scale it, because it doesn't make money, and it shouldn't make money. Thirdly, and now we're getting on to my last book, How to Win an Information War. How do we actually compete in this space? How do we compete in a space where there's so much disinformation, where there's so much polarization? Because the best regulations and the best design will always be exploited. Bad actors will exploit it. Propagandists will find a way around. They spend their whole day analyzing people's vulnerabilities and exploiting them. That's their jobs. And it is completely unclear who can compete with them. You have one side, whether it's in Russia or it's political propagandists, treating information as a weapon with very, very clear aims. And then you have another side talking about fact-checking or exposing lies in a world where people just select the truth that they want. There's a disbalance there. I'm not saying journalism has to stop being journalism. It clearly has a role. I'm not saying fact-checking should stop. I think fact-checking is important, noble, and often very courageous. But it won't beat the propagandists. They're playing a different game. One is trying to elevate truth. The other ones are manipulating people who don't care about truth. It's a different competition. One are working with identity, hate, distraction. The others think it's a competition between information and disinformation. It's not. Yeah? And that was the great insight that the hero of my last book, Sefton Delmer, realized when he looked at Nazi propaganda. Kind of in despair from the various failed attempts to compete with authoritarian propagandists, I turned to history. And I found this character. He led the British operation to subvert Nazi propaganda. And I'll just very briefly summarize his principles of work, and then we can have a discussion. But he's a very contemporary character. He also believed that liberal media was talking to itself. Yeah? German opposition media to Hitler, the German service of the BBC, they were all preaching about democracy to Hitler's followers. Yeah? They were trying to convince Nazis that democracy was wonderful. And he thought this was absurd. He knew Germany very well, he knew the Nazis very well, he had an incredible career as a journalist, as an investigative journalist, but he knew that this sort of journalism would not work against the Nazis. And basically he saw three principles that the Nazis were using, all of which had very little to do with the truth. One, they allowed people to express their most unpleasant emotions and normalize them. Two, they created a sense of community for people very confused about what Germany was, what their nation was. And third, and here I think is the most interesting thing he looked at, the Nazis gave you a way to act and to be. They gave you a language through which to experience the world, a uniform to wear, a hat to wear, a sense of superiority. Actually, the Nazis experimented with what is essentially a very early form of social media. They'd even give their soldiers notebooks, diaries, with spaces in them for photographs, and they'd give them cameras. They'd mass-produce cameras. So when soldiers conquered France, they'd photograph themselves like selfies, put them into the diaries, write what they were doing, and send it back for public readings in schools and families. Essentially Facebook. Get everybody involved in this common theater. There's wonderful memoirs, actually, of Scherer, who was this chronicler of World War II, walking around Paris, just amazed. Why are all the German soldiers taking photos? They were like tourists today with selfies. It's completely planned. But of course, like the Nazi marches, the whole dramaturgia of Nazism was all about getting you together into a play. The Nazis would have loved social media. I mean, it's a perfect medium for them. And they do again, yeah, exactly. So Delmer wanted to undermine that. And he did lots of things which were controversial. He basically set up dozens of radio stations which did not try to preach. They were full of furious German soldiers or cabaret artists, a lot of them Jewish, playing German soldiers, using the fury and the violent emotions of the Nazis against them, full of pornography, full of tabloid humor, telling the full horror of life on the Western and Eastern Front. He developed alternative forms of community, the church, the army, the region, to counterbalance the Nazi idea of the Volk, so he thought about community. And thirdly, and I think most sophisticatedly, he was always trying to get people to be actors that took control of their own lives. He had a deeply theatrical view of human nature. He was always provoking people to carry on acting, to carry on playing roles, but playing roles that they controlled. Yeah. So you're not playing the Nazi role, you're playing the role of a soldier who makes himself ill to get sent from the front, or you're playing the role of a saboteur who sabotages a boat. He gets into quite sophisticated psychological games to basically get people to start acting themselves. So people are no longer following the theater that the Nazis give them, but start developing their own identities. So I'll pause there, because I think we've been on a bit of a huge journey from my parents, from the 70s, through to today, and back to the Second World War. And I think we should stop at the Second World War. And you can take us back to today.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you. You actually struck at the heart of the arguments, and when you speak about, how they did propaganda in Germany and how you imagine counter-propaganda, it's very topical actually, and we should reflect on this about Romania today. And with this, I'm inviting my colleague Otilia to take the stage. One thing I forgot to mention at the beginning, we will have the 4 brief presentations by my colleague, which cover the report, and then we'll have at least half an hour for Q&A. So you will have time to address questions to Peter and to any one of us. We will not rush it, and I'm inviting my colleagues to put the slides on for Otilia's presentation. Peter, you may want to stay there to see the slides. Yes.
Thank you. So actually made a presentation which is a little bit skewed to the right, so that it can fit my colleagues without disturbing the message. So as you know, every year we are launching a report which we call the annual report, and which brings up the topics which we consider as the most important for the year. And of course, this year is about how on earth did we get where we are today. So last year in December, there was a huge and surprising result at the elections, and which seemed to come completely out of the blue. And we tried to understand, first of all, how did we get there? What were the failures of policies, and what are the risks for the future, and how do we get out of this situation in which we find ourselves today? So, to anybody who looks from the outside, I think for Peter as well, Romania looks like a really crazy place because you get the elections at late November, early December, in which candidates of the ruling coalition who are the favored, do not make it to the second round, nor the expected challenger from the extremist party our. But you get some person that nobody has ever heard about, some red-trousered guy who is a promoter of conspiracy theories, who surprisingly wins the first round with actually with a comfortable margin. But if you take things a little bit further, you see that despite the results of last year's elections, despite the incumbent president being unpopular, despite the ruling coalition getting a clear vote of non-confidence, you see you have the same president, you have the same prime minister, and almost the same cabinet. Yes? So how can this happen? And first of all, why did we get such a massive rejection from the public of the status quo and of the mainstream politicians? Of course, first of all, the period 2001-2024 was for Romania unexpectedly calm in terms of electoral cycles. It was an unusually long period in which we didn't have elections, and then in 2024 it was a super electoral year. Of course, everybody and all the politicians across the world had a massive loss of popularity because of pandemic and then the war in Ukraine and then inflation, so it wasn't easy for anybody. But what made Romania really stand out was the fact that the state's response was really inept to all these challenges. And there was an increasingly perceived fracture between what are the priorities of the politicians and what are the worries and anxieties of the common folk. And we saw that already in 2020, because we had elections in December after the first few months of pandemic. And the fact that the state reacted with really ad hoc, not thought through, in garrison language communicated measures, quite restrictive, with arbitrary application of the law on the most helpless, while some people seem to have parties with impunity, you get already in 2020 the unexpected result of our 9% in parliament. So this is exactly what happened last year as well. So we actually missed a massive opportunity because in this 4-year period we would have had opportunities to do all the difficult reforms that were supposed to happen. Be there election code amendment, be there votes in 2 rounds for local elections, be there massive administrative reforms, absorption of EU funds. So all these things would have been possible to be addressed in this period, but they weren't. But the worst thing that happened was this increased sensation that people were being treated unfairly, the inequity of treatment. We have the special pensions, we had the special centers for vaccinations, we have arrogance of politicians who did expensive trips. I'm not going to mention who because you know very well the scandals. But also in 2021, there was an outright betrayal and a turnaround of the popular vote by politicians behind the scenes when there was this supermajority formed, despite one of the parties having won the elections by a clear promise to fight their now partner in governance. And this coalition was branded, you know, to add insult to injury, as a coalition for stability. And some pundits were actually arguing that there was a very, I don't know, brilliant foresight of the president that, you know, in November 2021, he knew that Russia is going to attack Ukraine in February 22. So this is why he created this stability coalition. And this is why 2024 was actually a payback time. So you get an unusually high, for Romania, rate of participation, 52% of attendance in the day of the elections compared to around 40% in 2016. And you have a flat rejection of the status quo. 65% of the people, be they extremists, be they reformists, they voted against the status quo. And then you have the cancellation of elections, which was based on investigations and on data that were communicated by the authorities, but they weren't done by the specials. There weren't results of investigations done by the police, by the intelligence services, by the public authorities. All the evidence that you see is actually what journalists of investigation and watchdogs produced for them. And then, what do you get in the past 2 months? Absolutely zero accountability. Who should have looked into the campaign financing? Is this a TikTok candidate? Or how about the offline? Because he was supported by various networks of meditation groups to Ponzi schemes or churches or whatever, including extremist groups, that they weren't even being investigated by anybody. And what is worse, we have no lessons, we learned no lessons for the elections that we are going to repeat in May. So how do we expect that the results in May are going to be any different from what we got in December? And of course, there were no resignations nor dismissals. Of course, one of the consequences is the fact that our prosperity is not so guaranteed anymore. You get populism and bad governance, and we have huge twin deficits that we explained in last year's report. Sluggish economic growth, so only 1–2% compared to what we had experienced and predicted before. And we have very poor absorption of EU funds, very poor attraction of foreign investments, and also higher costs of the huge debts, simply because, when you have already 2 rating agencies downgrading our rating, then the interest increases as well. So what you can read in this report? First of all, and my colleague Septimius is going to present this part, it's about what went wrong in the electoral processes. Who should have done what? Then we are going to, Madalina is going to talk about what we can do about the online, yes, TikToks and everything else. And based not on, some ideas that maybe we should make TikTok report to some Romanian authority, but looking at the instruments that actually are in law. And then we are going to look a little bit, I'm going to make the last presentation again, about the energy sector and how it's better for us to play on the European team and not with Putin. And it's actually quite important for us to understand who exactly is the pro-European, because for me it's not clear anymore. And I will invite Septimius to take the floor and continue with the...
Thank you. I will do my best to try to explain and put together some of the things. Some of them were already said. We already had some reports also with our colleagues from the Vote Correct Coalition, which I'm happy some of them are here. But I think this section of the report tries to put together a little bit more structured and try to find some explanations for what happened. I don't think we have all the answers, and probably this is one of the main criticisms that will underline. And good luck to me to explain this in a very short time. But at least I'm trying to point out what do we think it went wrong, and what, probably most important, what we think it should be done. Because if we just ask ourselves, okay, what went wrong, but don't try to find solutions, I think it's just we just go halfway. First of all, we think it was what happened in November and December, because we don't have to forget the parliamentary elections. We discuss a lot about the presidential ones, but I think the parliamentary ones are as important as the other ones. We think that there was an institutional failure and a malfunction of the oversight mechanism. If institutions have done their job, I don't think we'll be here. And I will explain better which institutions and what it went wrong. But I will start with probably one of the most important parts of the process, which is related to the 3 controversial decisions which were taken by the Constitutional Court. And I don't think we should look only on the cancellation of elections, because I think all of them have created this situation, have led to this situation, actually. The first one was the elimination of Mrs. Șoșoacă from the competition. And I think here, as we already underlined, the problem is that there was no legal basis to remove a candidate, and instead it created a basis of eliminating candidates which is not regulated by the law, basically. So now we have precedents, and I think everybody asks, we ask ourselves what will happen in May. Will these candidates be removed, on what grounds? Because at these points we don't have legal convictions, we don't have restrictions which will not allow the candidates to be a part of the process again. The second one was the recount. We think that the reasonings for doing a full recount, a very untransparent recount, which breaks a lot of international standards, we don't see the reasons for doing the recount, otherwise but political ones. And the problem with recount, I think it also proved, for us at least, it showed us the limited access to justice, in the sense that we wanted to observe the process. We managed to see only 2 recount commissions. But we had to sue almost all with some of our partners, we had to sue the commissions to get access. And I think what's problematic is that we got answers to some of these complaints even 4 or 5 days after the recount was done. So to get access to see the recount, which I think it shows a little bit the limited access to timely procedures. And the last one is, of course, the cancellation. I think it's very good that we have a position of the Venice Commission. Unfortunately, I've seen in these days very diverse position regarding that position. I think it's a very tough one. I was reading for some politicians saying that it's just a comparison study. It's not a comparison study, and I think it obliges the Romanian state to take into consideration the need for reform. Probably there are several problems with the cancellation. First of all, I think it's the lack of legislation. The decision was based on a legal framework which is not specifically regulated. For example, the ex officio decision of the Constitutional Court to cancel the elections. And I don't think we have all the answers to the reasons. As Otilia already said, I will repeat some of the things Otilia said. We have information. It was public. Some of them were public even 2 weeks before the elections. I mean, there were some investigations. We also had some reports. So it's nothing incredibly innovative. And just to give you a comparison regarding the cancellation of elections, we calculated probably in the last 20 years there were around 20-30 elections canceled all over the world. Most of them were probably in countries where there is some kind of, I don't know, political skirmish, so not necessarily based on very legal issues. But in Europe, there are very few of them. Probably the most recent ones were the elections in Berlin, and in 2016 we had the elections in Austria. But I think just as a comparison, the decision of the Constitutional Court in Austria was 175 pages, and there the reasoning was an issue about bad management of postal votes, among others. I'm not saying that we should write 500 pages just to write, but I'm just saying that we have 4 pages on the cancellation of elections. Also in Berlin there were 300 paragraphs or more even, I don't remember exactly. So it's about explaining why you cancel election, which is an extreme decision in the end. but I will get back to recommendations. Structural, institutional, and decision-making politicization. We've seen a strong politicization of the entire process, including changing rules before the elections, and I think that changes the regulation very close to the election. And also, at the beginning of this year, we had an emergency ordinance which was completely untransparent. By the way, it was published in public debate after it was approved, which is, I think, ridiculous. And it includes some changes which were not discussed. I mean, after all this entire story, you would expect to see at least transparency and discussion with the civil society, with the parties, with the media. There was none, absolutely none. And I think another thing is the electoral manipulation by mainstream political parties. I mean, we observed the election day with our partners from the Vote Collect Coalition, and there were not, I know, structural fraud. But we've seen later that PSD tried to manipulate votes for our, and we did get complaints during the election day. And I think also it's interesting, it's important to look at the Liberals' campaigns, and not just this one, you know, the already famous book campaign for Mr. Ciucă, but also the recent campaign which was somehow hijacked by Călin Georgescu. I think all these things are electoral manipulations which affect the election day. So, what do we do? First of all, I think we are still waiting for some explanations. I don't think at this point we have more. I think at this point the media does a better job than the institutions who should provide answers. We know that there are some complaints, we know that there are some criminal cases, but we don't know enough. And there's not too much until the next elections, and I don't think we afford to get into the May's elections without knowing what happened in November. And also some criminal investigations, I think, we expect to see. Of course, we don't want to see overnight just to have some numbers, but I think it's important to have timely criminal investigations to understand what was illegal in this entire story and what was not. And in the end, how much was foreign interference, Russian interference in this? Because at this point, it seems to be more a Romanian work. It's domestic influence. We've seen several investigations showing potential issues with the financing from Romanian stakeholders. So I think we are still waiting an answer for this one. How much was foreign, how much was national? And I think it's very important that the institutions which failed, and now I'm looking at we were referring also, we will see the report of the Permanent Electoral Authority. I think there is an issue with how the Secret Service is performed. So I think the leadership of the institutions which failed to do their job needs to resign or to be removed from the position before the next election, and the new process should not be politicized, naming the new leaders. And the last thing I think which, before going to more specific recommendations, is an efficient and transparent civilian control over the secret services. We don't know exactly what the secret services did in this period. I mean, apart from these reports that we've seen, we don't know exactly, we understand that there are the tools to monitor, I don't know, including campaigns such as that on TikTok or other kinds of interference. But I don't think at this point we have enough information what was their role. So I think we need to understand how they work or how they don't work, basically. So in terms of very specific, I will try to finish quickly. So in terms of very specific things, there are probably much more than this. But firstly, I think we should look very closely at the Venice Commission opinion. Again, I don't think it's a comparative report. I think it's a very strong critic on the Romanian state. And I think it starts from the decision of the Constitutional Court to cancel elections, because I heard very much that it's a very general opinion. I think if you look closely in the opinion, it refers to the decision of the Constitutional Court. And I think we need to clarify, can the Constitutional Court cancel elections and in what conditions? At this point, we have a very vague article, and I don't think it provided the leverage to cancel elections. Also, I think the candidates' registration needs to be changed. We have questions even about the 2019 elections. There were 8 criminal cases for potentially illegal signatures. Now we have, again, complaints. I think it's ridiculous that we try to gather 200,000 signatures, but we don't verify them truly. And The Central Electoral Bureau does just an administrative job, looking at do we have the, I don't know, do we have the writing, is it okay, is it on paper, is it signed, but that's it. So I think we are basing our entire process on something which might be a big lie in the end. And you know, there are rumors, you know, everybody's saying, well, we use companies or somebody raised the signatures. And if you find out in 10 years, there's nothing you can do. I mean, there's not enough leverage to fix this kind of issue. Also, we need to better regulate recounts. Everything which was done for the recount was ad hoc. There was basically an invented procedure because there are regulations only on election day and some county level recount. But do we do a full recount without clear regulation? And I think we did have an issue with this one. I was saying also earlier about the access to judicial remedy, and it's not just about us. There were other complaints, for example, the definition of the political party for the parliamentary elections, and the party who complained in court got a reply in December, late after the parliamentary elections were ended. So I think if we don't get answer in real time, it's very unuseful. And I think we were probably quite critical on the work of the Central Electoral Bureau, which is not transparent in the full sense. We tried to meet with these commissions, but we got the reply, and I think it's a little bit funny that there was no need to meet with us. So I think it shows a little bit on the perspective of the electoral body regarding the transparency. And lastly, the use of emergency ordinances, of abusive emergency ordinances without transparency, I think it's a huge issue. And just a few things about subsidies, because we didn't talk about political finance. First of all, we think the budget should be reduced even more. Last year, it was ridiculous. We had 386 million lei for subsidies. This year, it should be reduced with 25%, but it's still too much, without any kind of explanations. The mechanism to allocate these funds, which says that it can be between 0.01, 0.04 from the GDP, it's ridiculous. I mean, it can get up to 800 million lei, which is huge. So I mean, we need to have a more predictable criteria, and we need to abandon the increase of these funds through rectification. In September, more than 70 million were allocated to political parties, although it's not clear why. And just to give you maybe the last thing, which is very important, and I know that also there are many who like this, transparent contracts. We don't know how money from subsidies are spent. We have campaigns such as the one from PNL, and we don't know exactly how the contracts look like. Here is just to see a little bit on the increase of subsidies. So in 2025, we're around here where the red X is. But just to give you a number, in 2024, subsidies plus reimbursement were more than 1 billion lei. Billion, you heard right. In terms of campaign finance, we do see a need of the strengthening of the control of expenditure by the Permanent Electoral Authority. We think it was a failure how the authority acted for monitoring the campaign finances. It's not just checking the documents afterwards. I think an oversight body should do more and should be proactive. We need a legal requirement to public to have interim reports, basically. Before the presidential elections, basically for 2 weeks, between 8th of November and 26th of November, we didn't know how much money the candidates brought. And I think this is, again, a failure of the Permanent Electoral Authority, because data was hidden, basically, not published. So we need this in the law. And I think generally how the expenditure looks like for our campaign election. So parties spend a lot before the campaign itself. Actually, we had the highest expenditure in 2024 in April, which was before the elections, without transparency. But when it comes to the election period, you're very limited. So I think it's a completely unfunctional criteria. And lastly, because we were discussing about reimbursements, which are quite a lot, we think that there are also issues with the source of the private funding, not only how the subsidies are spent, but we found out, for example, for the parliamentary elections that there were tens of candidates who declared zero funding, but they registered more than 40,000 euros in the campaign. So if you don't have money, how do you give money to the election campaign? So I think all these things together shows us that we have enough question marks about the campaign itself, and I don't think we can get into the next campaign without clearing these things. And sorry if I was too long.
Madalina.
Hi. Oh, yeah. Thank you. So, hi, this is going to be, let's say, a short introduction into our world in the last years when it comes to monitoring the online space. Have you ever heard about the hitting button on TikTok, or have you ever heard mentioning of what a hitting button is? Unfortunately or not, this is a documented practice that allows TikTok employees to manually amplify in the For You feed and make content viral. This is submitted in the call for evidence of the European Commission. This is documented in various investigations internationally. It's not a conspiracy. It's more or less a documented practice that is yet unknown. Might raise one call or another about ethics. However, funny or not, regarding ethics, this morning, and it's a weird timing, but it's true, I received an email from TikTok asking why Expert Forum wants access to our research API and what are your ethics surrounding research on TikTok. Kind of turning back the table against us once again. My short presentation will be a little bit about the radical transparency that Peter mentioned, and I really love that term. Why? Because it's the reality that we are facing today. Social media has changed in a way that I honestly never expected it to become such a powerful tool for our lives. And I believe we need to shift the conversation and to understand how much power it has. My presentation will be specific on Romania, but the realities are far more reaching. In Romania, you can see, we never actually looked at it because it's very hard to look at it. It's not a blame of journalists, media, think tanks, monitoring, even the state, I would say, specifically on this platform, because it's almost impossible to look at it. The data access, it's that bad and that specific to a certain point and the window that you are allowed to see that actually understanding trends, it has become nearly impossible. My short presentation will look at monitoring, some short recommendations that we have and we have shared with authorities and our fellow colleagues in the civil society. And last but not least, I would like to also discuss about our realities in Romania. So you can say that this is where it started from, which is our report that basically monitored all presidential candidates before the first round of elections. We are doing this since the last 4 years. We have been doing it for some time because we believe it's relevant to see how the impact of social media grows on the voting behavior. Flash news we've seen. Now, specifically on this monitoring, what we saw is basically because we looked at an inauthentic growth of a candidate that was very, let's say, unimportant in the polls, in my opinion, rightfully so, with a couple of weeks before elections. What you can see and what the difference is, and that we are just afraid to talk about, even when it comes to PR press releases from the company, is that they insist on looking on the official accounts. Honestly, they don't matter. Real amplification happens to coordinated accounts. What does a coordinated account mean? A sports account, a fan account that overnight becomes a political account with a single mission, which we know what it was. And I would very much so like to, let's say, step into this discussion with the premise, and you can take it with a grain of salt belief that this coordinated account, in our experience, happened through our documents, monitored and, let's say, also sent to authorities regarding how many accounts we identified. We publicly showed how many accounts we identified and so on. Passing forward. Why is this a problem? And in our honest opinion, we don't even have the basics. We don't even have the basics to understand what's happening in our second world, which is online. You have the second biggest platform that doesn't give significant data access compared to Meta, that has its own bunch of problems, and we can talk about how data access is lacking in general. Comparing with the second, let's say, one of the most information tools that we have in Romania, the data access, it's a joke. It's a joke when it comes to what you can see. When it comes to political content, it's such a stupid way to go forward, believing we can just ban it. Can you ban a part of your society for talking about an important topic? Obviously not. It's a social media platform. People socialize about what is important for them. Simply stating that you are banning a conversation doesn't help anyone, doesn't help any part of the society in having meaningful conversations. But do you know who it helps? It helps social media platforms for saying they are not liable for that content on their platform. And this is how they're trying to spin, unfortunately, this topic as well. We have identified, in Germany they have identified multiple political ads that go against TikTok's own terms and regulations. On Meta, there's also research regarding how this mechanism has been abused. Why is this a problem? Because on this specific platform, you cannot even properly research it. You do not know how much money was spent. There is actually no obligation from them to disclose the company that paid for that ad. It is a wild west for disinformation. So when you hear that there is data and nothing was wrong from the part of platforms, I cannot honestly say anything more other than the fact that it's a lie. It's a lie according to the minimal access that we managed to create for ourselves. I don't think this is going to help in us getting access to the research API. But now, this is an example. This is an example for a trend that I was trying to research since December, and I failed. I'm sad I failed, but why I failed? Because there is literally impossible to research. This is a secondary account of the candidate Călin Georgescu. I have looked at all the presidential candidates. It was not, let's say, a way of me highlighting the specific candidate. He was the only one that had this anomaly. What is the anomaly in question? That from one day to another, he managed to get 300,000 followers on a social media platform and naturally migrate his followers to a secondary account to avoid the limitations and so-called moderation, that's a joke as well, from the platform. How can you go forward for that? Can you see, was it a coordinated campaign? Who paid for it? How many of these accounts are actually inauthentic, so basically fake? Impossible to tell. You are just gonna receive an automated, more or less robotic message if you're gonna ask those questions. Going forward to ads published by day. And this is a problem of the role of social media in our society. A for-profit social media, but unfortunately, it's actually an information environment. And this is very problematic. I would look at Romania, when the problem is that not that people are voting for the far right, that's a legitimate concern and evolution of our society. The problem is how people's vulnerabilities are being exploited through a mechanism that is built for profit and basically creating anomalies when even the sweet right, the sweetheart of the far right, our George Simeon, has been basically dethroned by a candidate overnight. This is the anomaly, not the vote itself. And you can see that here in Romania, one day before the elections, you had an insane amount of ads published in that day. Can we go further than that? Can we see what were those ads? What they were supporting? Was there any content moderation on that? Flash news. You cannot see. There is no way of actually downloading that data and interpreting it like you can on Meta, with a lot of problems, with a lot of limitations, but you can. You can highlight false vulnerabilities in the platform. Here, you cannot. This is just for you to have fun, how bad it works. Basically, if you write the name of Călin Georgescu on TikTok ad library, you will have results in Chinese from Chinese companies, because it works that well. Try to do research, I dare you. Solutions going forward, and here, please take them with a grain of salt, is like, you go forward, you learn, you will fail, not perfect ones. In our opinion, we have this amazing opportunity and burden and probably a little bit of over-regulation that is called the Digital Services Act, which is the digital constitution of the European Union, the Brussels effect that I'm not sure it will work, but I hope at least it will enhance some access to data. Why is this so important? Because we are not even in the steps of doing the basics of monitoring our societies, looking at inauthentic behavior and researching if we are being interfered through coordinated accounts. I cannot honestly give you an answer right now because the access to data is so bad. You have to file long applications, they get rejected, you don't get an answer, you get an email from TikTok early in the morning when they ask you, have you considered ethics? Yes, I have considered ethics. What now? Are you going to reject my application for that? How can we build a defense when we don't impose real transparency requirements? And this is something that we are allowed. Not only we are allowed, we have passed through the Digital Services Act that it's in implementation from some time. And I think that right now, it is the time to go forward and work together because unfortunately, capacity isn't built overnight in national institutions either. And here is our proposal on the German model on an advisory board in the implementation of the Digital Services Act. Again, why you should take it with a grain of salt? Because the majority of the attributions in regulating VLOPs, which is big platforms, it's in the attribution of the European Commission. But fortunately, I hope this preparedness for systemic risks, which is the elections are a systemic risk because the risk of foreign interference and so on is greater. So under the regulation, my hope is that national institutions will also have the capacity and will be allowed to work more with VLOPs. Here is where I think civil society, private companies need to intervene as, let's say, trusty actors in enhancing the capacity nationally through an advisory board. It's not a perfect model, but I honestly believe that Romania is not the only case, and by far is not the only case, where capacity is lacking in implementing digital regulations. And lastly, preparing the scene. For me, it's absurd and yet somehow plausible that we do not have a plan France has a plan, if you want to discuss about it, they just ban any political ads, but that we as the European Union don't have a plan of how we actually prepare nationally for elections online. Most of the political content is not through banners anymore. How do we safeguard our citizens while protecting their freedom of speech? How do we transpose national legislations online? Most of it is myth, checking boxes and pretending we are actually doing something, but we do not have a basic consultation with VLOPs that are actually meaningful. I mean, actual commitments from the platforms, not only, oh, we heard you, National Institution of Romania, we are very concerned about what's happening. We will reply in 1-2 months as allowed by our schedule. This lack of preparedness at a national level with social media platforms, fortunately, can be changed as long as we manage to leverage our existing regulations into cooperation and less in over-regulation. But this is another topic of over-regulation I would love to share and chit-chat if you want after.
Okay, so this is going to be the last presentation of the day, and I will make it a little bit shorter. Of course, each of us at the Expert Forum think that what each of us is doing is really, really the most important thing, and I think that's energy, but probably you won't feel the same. I think still that energy is very important because right now it's at the very interplay between energy and propaganda that Putin is fighting his hybrid war against the West. And this is why I wanted to share a few insights from what we wrote in this report on this subject. First of all, you know, I've spoken for many times with different occasions. We have two major problems in our energy policy. First of all, that even though we are expecting to have an increase of production of gas, the fact that we have plans to increase the consumption of gas even much more than the production over the long term means that we have faced two choices. First of all, if we don't increase the consumption, then we can really displace Gazprom from the region, and that will have some massive consequences also in political terms. And second of all, if we do increase the consumption, then we are going to compete with everybody else for alternatives to Gazprom. So which one do we want to go to? Yes? So this is actually from an official report. It's the Transgaz plan for development of the gas network, and they show that if we indeed do Mintia power plant, the restructuring of Oltenia coal-fired to gas, and also expand gas consumption to the whole population of the country, we are going to have a gap of 5.5 billion cubic meters of gas, which we'll have to procure from the region and not from the new production in the Black Sea. Second of all, again, this is a topic that I've spoken many times before, is the fact that we have a lot of a backlog of investments in the energy sector. We have a huge amount of money waiting to be absorbed, and which should be invested in areas in which there isn't a market, like grids. And at the same time, you are going to have an explosion of consumption of electricity because of everything, you know, AI, electromobility. A lot of things are going to switch from other fuels to electricity. But what we have is a sort of reluctance to do all these investments. So, and also we have some populistic announcements, particularly after Mr. Trump got president, and we see also a change in the public positions that our politicians have. They say that maybe we should rethink the absurd greening policy of the European Union. Hello, we are getting 15.6 billion euros only from that bloody greening policy. Yes? So every polluter, every emitter of gas, of CO2 in Europe is paying in a fund which is distributed to us and 9 other countries. Yes? We are net beneficiaries of this policy and not net contributors to it, just like we are with EU funds. So if we are going to fight against this absurd greening policy, then maybe we are fighting against ourselves. I'm just going, Sorin criticized me because this is not something that you see, but I have two figures that I want to show you. This is January 22, this is January 25. This is how much we invested in new production, and this is almost exclusively people putting panels on the rooftops. So where are these investments in the, I don't know, commercial scale? Why don't people invest, why don't companies invest in Romania? We have, in 3 years after the war started, the same amount of new capacities installed, apart from these rooftop panels, like Moldova, the Republic of Moldova. And just in the 2 years after the war started, 2022, 2023, this is what Transelectrica was telling to investors. You have zero capacity here in the most favorable area of the country for renewables. You have zero capacity to connect new capacities. So what is our policy, really? Why is this all important now? I mean, we are used to policy failures in the energy sector for, I don't know, 20 years at least. But right now, we are in a critical moment, yes? And I'm going to explain a little bit why. I think right now we are at a critical point in which there is a very strong interplay of energy and propaganda, and this is one of the strongest weapons that Putin has over Europe right now. This is the gas that was being sold from Russia to Europe ahead of the war, and these are all the connections that failed. Only this one is operating. What happened last year was that this final line was also, the gas transit was discontinued at the end of the year. And that made Putin really furious, because it's not only a matter of money. Yes, Gazprom would make $5–6 billion yearly from continuing this transit, but it's not about this money for him. It's a matter of image. He has two different messages. One is for the outside world, one is for his domestic public. The message that he sends at home is greatness. We have this huge company which is able to give cheap gas to our consumers, but that gas was actually cross-subsidized from European consumers, and now it will have to come from the budget. So all that greatness is gone. It's very interesting to see that, for example, even though all of us know that Gazprom makes $6–7 billion per year losses. They reported, in a few months ago, that last year Gazprom Group made a record profit because they aggregated also with the oil subsidiary, which is indeed very profitable. But why do they do this? Why doesn't this message come to Western audiences? Simply because we in the West know a little bit of accounting. Yeah? And now, of course, the propaganda abroad is, Gazprom can provide you with the cheapest source of energy. So there were very intense last months of last year and early events in this year, because everybody knew that the gas transit was probably going to stop at the end of the year. So Gazprom made, so last year everybody was talking about different solutions, and it's actually a shame that we in Europe were kind of agreeing to these solutions. Maybe we should extend the gas transit, but we are not going to go to buy Russian gas, but somehow it's going to be Azeri gas. I mean, the numbers don't add up. It would have been Russian gas, but Azeri washed, yes? But then, at the end of the year, there were several things that happened. First of all, I think that was a brilliant operation, the fact that the Ukrainian army captured Suja, and also one of the measuring parts was destroyed. And that was actually one of the things which stopped some discussions about extending the contract, simply because any contract would have had to be concluded in any form at the border between Ukraine and Russia. What is the border now? I think this is a brilliant operation, image operation from Ukraine. Second, there was Gazprom cut the supplies to OMV after OMV simply refused to pay for gas after a result of an arbitration case, and Gazprom simply cut the supplies. That means that virtually out of 6 billion cubic meters per year from 15 which were transited through Ukraine simply went off the table, yes? And then there was the Azeri flight crash, which you know, and which really made Aliyev have to abandon any kind of, pampering up to Putin, yes? In 2024 in Romania, and I'm going to say a few words about this later, attempted to take the E.ON supply business. But in 2025, after the transit was completely terminated, there was a full weaponization of everything to try to get the transit resumed. You saw incredible statements by Fico. I'm going to cut electricity and humanitarian support for Ukrainians if we don't get the gas back. You saw Orban threatening to not approve the extension of sanctions unless he gets the gas transit back. But he also saw, maybe, some of you, the humanitarian crisis that happens now in Transnistria. So, there is an expression in Russian. It goes something like, beat yours so that the others are fearing you more. Transnistria is the most loyal region to Russia, but they are now exposed to a completely artificially caused humanitarian crisis because Russia is trying to persuade the government in Chișinău and Maia Sandu to put pressure on Zelensky to resume gas transit via Ukraine. So why does it matter what we do in Romania? As I mentioned, if you increase the gas consumption, you are going to fight with for gas with everybody else and leave also a room for Gazprom. It will be a re-entry point for this gap that is going to appear in 2028. Also, the delayed investments in electricity means that we will not so eagerly be willing to sell electricity to Moldova, or electricity is going to be expensive. You know that right now Moldova has to buy electricity from us because it's practically the only alternative available. But it also explains very interestingly, what went behind the MVM E.ON transaction last year. As you know, E.ON, the gas and electricity supply, wanted to sell its assets in Romania. Why they want to sell, it's very interesting, because, and that would be my first question if I were Minister of Energy. Probably it has something to do with the fact that the ministry still owes over 1 billion euros to suppliers, and suppliers have cash flow problems. Maybe that would be a consideration. So E.ON organized the tender. There were 3 offers. The two other offers were about 120 million. MVM offered, out of the blue, 200 million. So that's clearly beyond any economic justification. Yes. So why would MVM, which is a state-owned company in an authoritarian country, so that means it's fully controlled by Orban's cronies, want to take over a supply from Romania? And one of the possible explanations is the fact that maybe they had the intentions to buy gas from Gazprom and supply it to its current, to E.ON's current consumers, but also to this large gas plant that is going to be built and which would consume 2.5 BCM per year. Yes, a quarter of our current consumption right now. And that would explain why MVM was so active last year, trying to push for the extension of gas transit, even though through Ukraine, even though they don't buy from Ukraine, Yes, they buy on the Turk Stream. It explains why that big power plant, Mintia, was designated as a project of national importance. But it also does not explain how, in the heat of the discussions about whether we should sell or not sell the company to MVM, there is now a discussion about deprivatizing some energy assets. This is all from our side. I hope you enjoyed it, and we are asking you to ask questions to us. And did it very abruptly.
Thank you. Maybe we can put the primo slide. Thank you. And as I promised, we have almost half an hour for Q&A. And I will, take the privilege to ask actually one question to Peter. We are going back. We ended so nicely with energy and propaganda, but we go back to the online space and the structure and what we can do to have a better world. And then I was fascinated by this vision of reconceiving social networks as an urban space, right? Where we have now just shopping malls and red light districts. But how can we practically create the parks and the public spaces where people meet and the schools? I mean, what would be the tools? Is the DSA, the European regulation enough? How can we change? I mean, what kind of tools can we use? This is a macro level question. And the micro, actually I have two questions. I know you work a lot on researching out in the field. Is there a way to de-radicalize communities actually in a practical way, like in Moldova, Ukraine, Romania? I mean, we have several bubbles which are radical in their own way. Is there a way to address it somehow, online, offline? So there are two questions, and then let's deal with this, and then I'll take batches of 3 questions from the room as well, and let's use those microphones.
Yeah. Is that on? Yeah. So you were asking about funding mechanism rather than technology.
Funding, regulation, technology, everything.
Well, look, technology is being experimented with all the time. I mean, Google just developed something they're calling a Habermas machine after the German philosopher who tried to conceptualize the democratic public sphere, which is might be a very bad idea, but at least it's an attempt to create an AI system that helps people reach consensus and arguments.
I think we have Google in the room. No.
No, but like, there's experiments in Taiwan about creating debate spaces that build towards finding solutions rather than building on polarization. Look, there's as many ideas as there are technologists. The problem isn't pioneering technologies. The problem is scaling. And I think we have to think in terms of very big interventions. Again, history is helpful. We've been here before. Start of the 20th century, radio and newspapers are booming. After a huge amount of optimism around their use, authoritarians have seized control of them in the Soviet Union. In America, the most popular radio show in the 20s is this guy, Father Cochlin, who's a pro-Hitler, far-right priest. You have newspapers which are owned by oligarchs and tycoons who are tearing society apart, and in Britain the response is the creation of the BBC. A huge intervention into this space, saying, look, we can't just have, extremists and tycoons manipulating our information space. We need massive interventions. So that's the British tradition. I'm not saying we should all have a BBC, but you're talking about a huge intervention at scale. In America, that's highly unlikely. There is no tradition of that. Public service media in America is about, well, it's always been very weak, and I think it'll be weakened. But in America, you have this culture of civic spaces, Tocquevillian media, maybe something very local, but again, based on civic principles, not on commercial ones. In Europe, you have a tradition of successful public broadcasters in Sweden. What would be the social media version of that? I don't know about Romania. I don't know if you have a strong public broadcaster. I think you have to look at local traditions, how this happens. Maybe it's I was about to say the church, but that's probably not it. The depoliticized Romanian church. But I don't know. You have to look. In terms of the EU, I think it does have a role. But I'm not enough of an expert on the mechanisms of the EU. I don't know if it's DSA or... You guys know so much more. We've left the EU, so I'm barely paying attention anymore. But they have the sort of... there was a democracy action plan. So it might not be the DSA, it might be the DAP. And Vera Jourova, the former commissioner for nice things at the EU, she talked about this a lot. Look, there is an understanding. There is a project called Enlightenment 2.0, I think somewhere in the Commission, looking to conceptualize this. But yes, we are talking about massive interventions. What it isn't is, oh, here's a little counter-disinformation project. It's everything. It's from access to researchers, through to the creation of spaces, through to thinking about funding, thinking about taxes on commercial platforms to fund the non-commercial space. It's a whole ecology that we're talking about. These are always ecologies, but it does have to be at scale. I mean, that's why I talk about the example of the BBC. We're talking about, okay, if we're already misquoting Habermas, the structural disintegration of the public sphere, and that takes huge interventions to rethink it.
Yeah, sure. We have to see how we calibrate such actions in states where actually we're not sure authorities on whose side
Yeah,
they
so exactly, one has to, that's what I mean. In Sweden, there is a tradition, in Britain there is. I'm not sure that's the best tradition here. I don't know, so I can't say.
The famous questions like in development theory, how can we become Denmark? I mean, that's we should reflect.
Well, I mean, in America's case, by colonizing it.
How about de-radicalization?
Yeah, so listen. Look, I've worked, to answer this question, I created a sort of research unit, first at the London School of Economics, now at Hopkins, where we do that. We analyze audiences. Well, putting it very simply, we unite journalists and storytellers with sociologists, yeah? Because I still believe in journalism as storytelling, as research, as representing the people against the powerful, but I think it has to understand its audiences better. Simply shooting information into the ether and saying, the purity of the information will win, doesn't work. So trying to get journalists to think about their audiences, but also connecting documentary makers with sociologists, other types of storytellers. And we get into the weeds. So we looked at, for example, in Ukraine, there was this idea that people in southeastern Ukraine are very susceptible to Kremlin propaganda around history, yeah? Around Soviet nostalgia, around memories of World War II. And the Kremlin was pumping historical propaganda into Ukraine. But when we did the sociological analysis, we found actually only like 5 to 10% were really susceptible to it. You know, they are Stalinist babushkas. You're not going to move them, and that doesn't matter. And then there was a huge population in the cities, Odessa, Kharkiv, Kramatorsk, Dnipro, who were kind of flirting with this, but actually their values were totally, let's call them European, liberal. And the minute you started talking to them about late Soviet trauma, Chernobyl, Afghan war, suppression of private business in the Soviet Union, that it's not that their nostalgia ended, because the nostalgia was often irrational and private, but it meant that they no longer wanted that in the future. So we'd show them films about that and go, do you want Ukraine to be like the Soviet Union or like the EU? And they're like, oh, like the EU, of course. So, you know, what do we mean by de-radicalization? People have lots of private things which are, it's maybe not our business to intervene in. Our question is, what does it mean for society? Yeah? People can have any relationship they like with Soviet ice cream or whatever, or Soviet movies. That's fine. But the main thing is that they understand that their rights in the Soviet Union would have been trashed, and they don't want it in the future. So did we make them less nostalgic? No. But did we create content that made them definitely not want Putin's Russia in the future, or the Soviet Union in the future? Yes. So all that is perfectly possible. And it's not even radicalization, it's just talking to people. It's just listening and talking and not making assumptions that all of them there are crazy Soviet nostalgists. Because there's like 5 audiences there. And you've got to start talking to the ones that you can have a conversation with. And the Stalinist babushkas, maybe they're not that important.
Okay, that's an interesting conclusion for our May elections, actually. And as I promised, I'm now taking questions from the room. 1, 2, 3 hands. We are taking in this order. Can be for Peter or for any of my colleagues. They will come up on stage.
Hello, my name is Catherine Cagle. I'm actually a journalist from the United States. I am here on a Fulbright working for Freedom House. How surprised were you when about 1 week before the US election, Mark Zuckerberg went entirely against his mode of checking facts to say that he was now for free speech, which basically means no, to him, no censorship of information?
Okay, thank you. And this question is for Peter?
Peter.
Okay, the second question? We take 3. And please identify yourself, yes.
Hello, my name is Vlad Munteanu. I'm a social psychologist. I wanted to ask in continuation of what you were just talking about and your 2 questions. There is an informational war going on, let's call it a war, I don't know, I'm very dramatic that way, but there is also a neurobiological war happening. Our attention spans are being decimated. The people that are exposed to very fast social media have less attention span and therefore are less likely to be affected by long-form content that would help disprove some of their more magical thinking beliefs. While we're trying to determine what ideological path to take as a species in Europe at least, our neurology is being destroyed, and I wanted to ask, do any of these solutions, like spaces where people can have healthy debates, take into account both positive or negative, the addictive potential of the social media and how to counter it or how to match it in a way that is more healthy for the users? Thank you. Okay,
it was a rather long question. I hope people will be done. And the last one, on the back.
Hi, hello, Diana here from Smart Everything Everywhere. It's an NGO that supports digitalization here in Romania. Thank you for sharing Expert Forum and for sharing your work and for inviting Peter. I have a question for Peter, I had the same question as Sorin, but I have something in the same vein, similar, because I think it's very important. So you mentioned that the way forward, it's not regulating content, and I think this is the same position that Cass Sunstein had like 10 years ago in his book Republic.com, but at the same time we need to fight disinformation. How can we do this without engendering free speech and without regulating content? On the other side, I see you're not a fan of this, but the DSA, the Digital Services Act, like the cornerstone of digital regulation of FLOPs, it involves regulating content. The problem is that we don't have a clue how we can do that, because it would be huge work, as Madalina was mentioning. So if you have any insights of this, and I have another small question for Ottilia. I just heard Ms. von der Leyen saying at Davos that, we should kind of shift 180 degrees, kind of like Zuckerberg did with free speech now, cutting red tape, and this involves a lot the Green Deal and all the discussion around this, because it's so cumbersome, and it seems like we're getting, this means maybe giving up some of our values regarding decarbonization and all that. So if you have any thoughts on this. Thank you.
So 3 questions and 1 answer probably from Peter, if Madalina has something to add then on the essay, and Ottilia on Green Deal. Yes, please.
Oh, right, so let's take the disinformation one. Can I take that one quickly as well? So listen, what do you mean by disinformation? Disinformation, I think, is at least 3 things. Disinformation is content, so lies. So there, the only way to approach it is through existing categories of illegal content, child pornography, organizing to subvert elections, Or look, the attempt is to do it in terms of harms. Yeah? So there's harms to health. That's kind of content we should do something about. You know, there's harms to physical, you know, your physical environment. But then when you get into sort of harms to democracy, it's very, very hard to define it. We try to in Britain. We try to do a harms grid, and like the content harms to democracy, beyond like lying to people where the election ballot place is. You can probably ban that. It's really hard. But that's only one type of disinformation. It's the least important type with the internet. Yeah? There's disinformation also of not knowing who is behind something. Yeah? The deception of the source of the information. As we saw today, we had no idea who was behind these bloody campaigns. That's the problem. There isn't a problem that, like, there's one crazy Gheorghescu alternative medicine ad. The problem is 300,000, a hell of a whole ton who came out of nowhere. Who is that? That's the problem. So don't think of it in terms of content. Think of it disinformation in terms of the actor. We are blocked from knowing who the actor is. And thirdly, I would say, is disinformation of the whole system, not understanding how the algorithms work. Again, it doesn't even matter if there's one little piece of disinformation about, you know, drinking mercury is helping you from COVID. But if it's amplified really strongly by the system, yeah, we have a right to know that. So don't think about disinformation purely as content. It's all those types of deception, of barriers to our knowing, yeah, that hide our right to a share in reality. And the one on content is actually that we have a lot of rules on already. It's the other ones that we should focus on. Inside the DSA, I hear mixed messaging. Actually, if you look at the law, it's also about the other types as well. I don't think all the EU officials who've spoken on this topic have understood what they're talking about, especially a French one with wavy hair. Just because Mark Zuckerberg has turned out to be an actor who does not have the best interests of democracy top of his agenda, that doesn't mean that the regulators in Brussels are not making really bad mistakes, because they are as well. Yeah? And your thing, so again, access to research, we don't know how it's affecting people's psychologies very well because there's no access to the research. But the only thing I question about attention spans, look at the popularity of these long-form podcasts. They're huge. They go on for hours and 2 hours. So there's something much more complicated going on than just short attention spans. And in America, people don't like CNN-style news anymore. That's plummeting. But they will listen for hours to like Joe Rogan smoking bongs and talking to bullshit to people. So obviously what they're yearning for is community. You know, the nice thing about those podcasts is that you're in a community or you're with somebody. There's no structure, there's no dramaturgia, there's no format. It is just you're in a community. I do the same thing with football podcasts. I listen to them for hours as a way of having somebody to be with. I remember when I had this revelation when my daughter, who's now 18, she was like 6 or 7 at the time, came to me saying, "Dad, I'm watching all this stuff on YouTube." And I was like, at the time, I just stopped being a TV producer and just become an academic. And I was like, oh, show me these YouTube people. What interesting formats and narratives do they have? And it was just girls talking about their clothes or walking around their apartments. And I'm like, what the fuck is going on? There's no storytelling. There's no drama. Like, my profession as a scriptwriter is pointless. And I realized it was about loneliness. It was just about a community. So I don't know, yes, there's an attention problem, but then people spend 2 hours listening to Joe Rogan's nonsense. So it's complicated. It's not just that. But we totally need much more access to research to really understand the relationship between mental health and online dynamics. And what do they know about it, and are they making it worse? Are they liable for teenage depression? I'm not even talking about suicide. All this stuff is in a black box. I mean, sorry, listening to today was just, you know, amazing. Like, lack of transparency from the state, lack of clear laws around the online space, and lack of access to data. We're all living in the dark, just like, you know, trying to feel our way through. It's not Habermas's public sphere.
Any more to add on Zuckerberg issue? and he's...
I don't know. I was never part of the Facebook oversight board, so friends of mine were. So I don't know whether to be surprised or not, but it's clearly, look, he's thinking about the interests of his company. I think he always has. He may say words about democracy, but it's a business. So I just don't think that the future of American democracy is top of mind for him. So should we be surprised that a person who runs a business that makes 400 billion or something is not thinking about the subtleties of debate? He probably isn't. I mean, is that...
Madalina, you want to add something on digital?
Very short. Yeah, just very short, totally agreeing and supporting the vision. Also adding that this is how we should also think about the Digital Services Act. It does not regulate content. It shouldn't regulate content. It gives access and tries to give access to basically understand systemic risks like election interference and so on. And secondly, to the, let's say, impact of technology on our lives. I am a technology enthusiast, and I do believe it's a phase of humanity, and it's up to us of how we use it. And I choose to be, yet still, on the optimist side, where I believe there is a lot to be done on actually creating quality content that it's also positive content, and it works. Long-form content, it thrives in specific communities. We have a lot to learn and basically unite as a society to go there and also use technology as a force for good. Is not bad or evil. You can talk about algorithms, how they're used. It's a legitimate discussion. But ultimately, we are allowing it to be a force for evil through our inaction and relying on stiff actions and through stiff regulations as well. You can see I have a passion here. That's it.
Sure. Otilia, Green Deal?
Yes, thank you. So I'm not an environmentalist radical in any way. Green Deal is, criticizable, and any kind of public policy has trade-offs. Yes, and it should be periodically revised to see what we can improve about it, whether we have the same goals that we had before. But what really gets to me, and this is why I have this strong emotional reaction, is I think we should call on opportunism and bootlicking when we see it. Yes, so right now what we see is a pendulum swinging over to the opposite side just because there is a new voice in the White House. So the question is, okay, what's in our best interest? And I'm referring, my chapter is specifically about Romania. So what is our best interest? Do we want to lose 20 billion euros or not? That's a trade-off, yes? We have more interest in that greening policy than anybody else in Europe. So this is why I think we shouldn't, fall for populism, because if all the options that we have on the table are populist, then what can I say about, Georgescu versus the others if all of them are populist?
Yeah, thank you. We have time for another round. There's one here. Second, do I see another one?
Here.
Yes, here, the lady here. Please.
Good afternoon. My name is George Vișan. I work for the Romanian Diplomatic Institute, and I have a question for Mrs. Otilia Nuțu. I've seen the map with the grid. As you well know, we are investing a lot of money in nuclear energy. Will the new production capacity in the nuclear sector can be taken over by the grid, or the grid needs to be upgraded? And I'm not just referring to the SMRs, which are very far along, far away from now, but I'm referring to what's happening at Cernavodă. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Can we pass the microphone to Mrs. Laura Sifter? Here. Here. Maria. No, third row.
Mulțumesc mult! Hello, my name is Laura Stifter. I'm a teacher in Bucharest, and I have two small questions, but at first I want to thank you very, very much for your work, for the report, and for and also for the book. And I have two small questions to Mr. Peter. One is about the right to candidate. We had in Romania also a situation in which one of the candidates, one of the extremist candidates, was excluded from the elections, and probably now the candidate who had the best result at the first round will also be excluded. And I think of an aspect, the right to candidate has other limits, other legitimate limits, for instance, limits of age. If you had in Romania persons who are very young cannot candidate in the presidential elections. And I'd like to ask, in your opinion, if a person is against democracy, against the European Union and so on, should be excluded? Is it okay to do so, or should have the right to candidate, although the intention against democracy is clear? And the second question is more general, and I'd like to ask you, do you think there are situations in which we can defend liberal democracy with illiberal tools? And if yes, is this our case now in Europe and in Romania? Thank you very much.
Thank you. And the third one in the back over there, the gentleman. Can you help with the microphone? Yeah.
Hello, my name is Cătălin Tudor. I work in a corporation, and I have a question for Mr. Peter. What would be the best strategy against an extreme right-wing candidate, whatever he might be, in the presidential elections here in Romania, and if he would get involved in it? Thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah. Good one.
Good luck.
Please. Let's pick them
I
up.
mean, obviously, I can't. It's not. I'm not being diplomatic. I can't comment on Ukraine, on Romanian internal issues, because I know nothing about Romania. I have been here exactly 8 hours, and there's nothing more I hate than, like, I mean, my heritage is Ukrainian. I keep on doing this. You say this, actually. So my father is from Cherniv too. So, you know, this is coming through, this sort of like latent Romanian, greater Romanian is coming through me. And my father's from Bukovina. So I can't comment on anything here. On the extremist politicians, look, I'm not an expert on constitutional law. I know nothing about it. But what I do know a lot of is propaganda, and really what we've seen is extremist in the classic sense, in the Hannah Arendt sense of extremist, yeah, parties. Those who say others do not have rights. Yeah, that sense. Not extremist as in fringe. Extremist. The word extremist, by the way, is another one, a bit like disinformation. I think is very, very confusing. Disinformation isn't about content, and extremist is not about space. Extremism isn't on the fringes. Sometimes the extremists are right in the middle. Yeah? Extremist means, in the political definition, that you undermine the rights of certain groups of people to exist in society. Yeah? And extreme evil, in the kind of, you know, in the way Hannah Arendt would talk about it, is, you know, you start saying some people deserve to be obliterated. So extremist parties, in the sense they say some citizens have no rights, for a very long time ago, realized that they need to use the language of liberalism, yeah, to smuggle their way into mainstream discourse. So most strikingly, you had groups like the identitarian movement, whose aim was to rid brown people of the right to live in Europe, basically, yeah, to take away the rights of the citizens of France and Austria and Germany, and if they're not the right type of person, to strip them of citizenship and remigrate them, to send them back to where they once came from. That's their policy, yeah? But they adopted the language of liberalism. They said, we have to get rid of all Muslims because Muslims don't respect female rights. We're doing this because we are huge believers in women's rights, and Muslims don't respect that, therefore they should all lose their citizenship and get sent out of Europe. Now, slowly those ideas have been getting more and more and more mainstream, more diluted, but more mainstream, and now you have the AfD in Germany talking openly about remigration. You have the most powerful and rich person in America openly supporting them. The AfD's algorithmic position on X, on Elon Musk's platform, has shot up. We don't know why. Yeah. Is he helping them algorithmically? Is it organic? We don't know. How can anything be organic on a technological platform? They now talk about remigration in a more diluted form. So we've seen something that was completely classic extremist, laundered into the middle, and now is cloaking itself in the language of rights of women and free speech. Should we use, and that's, so the illiberals are using the language of liberalism. Should the liberals use the language of illiberalism? I mean, look, my last book is all about that. So you'll have to read it. It's about the very difficult compromises that you make, the things that will be lost if you do that, because things will be lost. If you do that, there will be great damage, but is that damage smaller than the gains? Though at the end of the book, I sort of conclude that actually it's not about adopting illiberalism, it's about reinventing liberalism so that we are not defenseless. Liberalism is not meant to be a suicide note. Yeah? So a little bit like with freedom of speech, we can take back freedom of speech. Yeah? We've let the extremists kidnap it. We can take it back. So I think we can take back, to update it and give it teeth, and we'll have to move away from a lot of empty ideas that just aren't working anymore in real life.
Yes, and Otilia is due with an answer on energy, yeah. And then we'll take another round of three. I think we have time.
Yes, so they are. That's one of the problems. The fact that all the plans that the government plans to put are actually blocking or foreclosing available capacity in the grid for connections for anybody else. So if they don't happen, also nothing else happens also in the private sector. That's the problem.
Yeah, thank you. I saw some hands here before. 1, 2, 3. Okay, in this order.
Yeah, so hello, I'm actually just a student doing my master's in the University of Bucharest, and I'm particularly specializing in football, and nationalism and extremism. And my question is, like right now, it appears to me that we talk about social media as if it's like an isolated thing that does not really exist in the real world. And I think that the analysis is correct that there is a lack of community, of identity, but this lack could be targeted in society. It doesn't need to be targeted in social media. And for example, to take your examples of listening to football podcasts, like instead of that, we could go into football stadiums with friends and like meet there and do stuff like this. And like my problem, let's say, a bit with how we talk right now here about social media is that we view social media as the remedy for issues in social media that are not caused by social media. Like the issues that we talk about, that we see materializing in social media, I think, are issues caused in our real world. For example, a lack of media literacy, a lack of community and identity, a loneliness, a certain alienation from each other in society and stuff like this. And my question would be if it would not be more helpful to focus on, let's say, I don't know how to name it, but maybe community infrastructure in reinvesting money in schools, in public sports and stuff like this. Like in Germany, for example, as one little example, we have a very good system of what we call Breitensport, so amateur sports, which helps with people to form communities, also with refugees and whatever, which can potentially help to undermine these effects. And then as a second little question on top of that, would be that lately there was a study made by an institute close to the German public broadcast about fact-checking, and the interesting thing there was that they said whenever a post was flagged as being fact-checked and then wrong, it would hinder people, even the people who don't really care about facts, from like how do you say, like from redistributing this content. So like it would drop significantly. So I think that fact-checking is still a pretty important tool, and that we should not give in so much maybe to this emotional side of information and try to combat it more rationally, because you spoke about this marketplace of ideas being undermined by emotion, blah, blah, blah. Like I think that there maybe it is helpful to not try to face populism with emotions, but more with like trying to stick to literacy and information maybe.
The orthodox menu. Yeah,
a little bit.
And your name is?
Anton Lösche.
Okay,
yeah,
okay, thank you very much. Interesting point. Bowling alone. Yeah, that's Robert Partner. Mircea.
Can I be the last one?
Ovidiu. Between you and Ovidiu.
Thank you. My name is Ovidiu Voicu. I have a question for Otilia because she's covering the most important topic. Yeah, and also because this week I have received these amazing offers for both my electricity and gas suppliers. My question is, can you tell us about your expectation, your view of what's going to happen after the April,
price, yes?
April 1st, yes, the Fool's Day, when the
price forecast.
Energy compensation scheme is ending, and if you think this will affect in any way the political landscape and potentially elections in Romania.
And now Mircea, I think he will agree to be the last.
Thank you. Mircea, as you said, is also Toma, working for the National Audiovisual Council, so it's the authority who's trying to regulate what's happening in the media environment. We work until these days, we used to work mostly focusing on traditional media. So the new medias with their new problems are putting us in a difficult position. We listened to your discouraging speech, and
it was quite solutions oriented.
We think that
for a public authority is discouraging.
Yeah, because we are disarmed to do everything you are recommending us to do. So abandoning to focus on content and moving the analysis towards the mechanism behind the whole spectrum of the digital space is for us, for the moment, an obstacle which we cannot be surpassed technically. And but I have let's say a little bit apart question. Do you think that media education could build a structure of resistance towards these phenomena? And if it would have, do we have the time to prepare the public to be critical in such a measure that this kind of systemic risks can be avoided? And the last one, if you should not focus on content, are you the real person pretending to be Peter Pomerantsev?
Okay, so media education, going back to communities, that's for Peter, and then Otilia will address Ovidiu's price forecast.
I mean, I have no idea who I am, but it turns out either I'm Romanian. I didn't even know that. Yeah, look, of course, the great challenge is that how do we transform the regulatory space around it? Education is great, but will take a very long time. Can we just focus on reforming how we regulate the space? And to your question, of course, we should think about all the other things. Propaganda, you know, in its essence, has always been in a dialogue with changes in society. I mean, my favorite philosopher of propaganda is a French guy called Jacques Ellul, who I quote, well, I discuss him a lot in the book. His whole idea that propaganda is actually the way societies organize common identity at a time after industrialization happens. People move from the countryside to the city. They feel very atomized and lonely. Propaganda becomes the way that they cure that loneliness. It becomes the community, and then it becomes possible to manipulate that. So it's always in a discussion with the rest of society. I think the point we're making is that this is the new space that we need to think about in terms of regulation, creation of new content. On this division, look, obviously fact-checking is great. I'm not against fact-checking. I just don't think it's enough. You know, I don't think we should put, you know, these vast changes in society on the shoulders of fact-checkers. You know, it's just unfair. Of course they have a role to play, and they're very brave people. Being a fact-checker in Brazil, let alone in Russia, is dangerous. You know, they will come after you for the truth. So fact-checkers are among, you know, they're like monks in the post, you know, in the Dark Ages, clinging on to, you know, the vestiges of Greek philosophy as the world around them disintegrates into conspiracy theories and alternative medicine fueled with political conspiracy theories. So fact checkers are among the most noble people of our age, but we can't put everything on top onto them. So I'll pause there.
Yeah, it's very tempting actually to add something. I mean, if you conceive propaganda this way, you know, with the advent of literacy, mass literacy, and then the radio, isn't this how nations were created?
Yeah. So listen, I'm not against
the famous. We created Italy, now we need to create Italians, but even more pronounced in Eastern Europe, you know, because we are more recent. And then you go very deep to very sensitive issues. Yeah. No? What is propaganda? What is nation building?
Well, I mean, like, you know, this idea that you know, the idea that nation building is built around an imagined community. Nations only exist as something in media, you know, novels, books, newspapers. Of course that's true. Maybe we should put this word propaganda to the side because it has all these negative connotations. Initially it was a, you know, it's a good word with a bad reputation, should we say. Or a neutral word with a bad reputation. But we're talking about how we do that. You know, do we have, is our community, our media organized community, is that held in the hands of some bizarre companies that we can't regulate? Or do we have or do we live in a digital republic where we have a stake in it and a voice in it? So it's more a question of how rather than whether. Looking at America right now and the crisis that it's in, I can think of no country that needs propaganda as a neutral term more than America. I mean, there is no society that I know of which is so full of people with a priori very little in common. I've just arrived there, I'm integrating into America with my Ukrainian British heritage, and next door there's a Guatemalan, and we have nothing in common. Not even a language, actually. And somehow we're meant to be united by stories, the American dream, you know, the American way of life, and media communities. So when those start to buckle in America, there's nothing. When that crashes in England, we have the class system and villages, where there's ways we can continue talking to each other. In America, it's actually quite stunning. I mean, this vast country is really held together by propaganda in the neutral sense. I'm not saying it is a bad way. I'm just saying that's just how it's held together. And so when it has a crisis, the consequences could well be existential.
And the closing answer from Ottilia to
No, I mean, I really love it how we have this grand conversation and then intersperse...
Gas prices!
Yes, what's going to be my gas bill next month?
I think that's a really good balance, actually. That's a really nice, you know...
Yeah, nation
perfect.
building
Yes.
plus gas price.
The imaginary community and gas price.
So I think you should follow Mr. Burduja because he promised to have tomorrow all the answers for you. He said that he's going to present the calendar of liberalization or whatever it's going to be. So tomorrow at the latest, go and ask Mr. Burduja. Thank you.
Okay, and with this we draw close to the Q&A part. And as I said, people who have volumes or who bought volumes, you can still buy them, are kindly invited here, and I kindly invite Peter to remain at this table to sign volumes.
Should I go over there, maybe?
No, here you're more visible, but let's take these glasses and the table.